Ladies and gentlemen, may I give you a very warm welcome to the 2009 William Dick Memorial Lecture. This lecture is being given in memory and in the honour of William Dick, who founded the school. He was the son of a farrier. He was born in Whitehorse Close at the bottom of the Royal Mile, and his dad strongly encouraged him to read veterinary textbooks. And so he ended up going down to the Royal Veterinary College in London, which had just newly opened. And after spending a few months there, he came back up here to start the Dick Vet School with the help of the Royal Highland Society of Scotland, which sponsored him. What do we do at the Dick Vet? Well, we obviously teach people how to become veterinary surgeons. And that's not just to go into practice, that's for the huge plethora of careers that veterinary surgeons can go into, such as government, pharmaceutical industry, research. We also have first opinion practices and very high-level referral centres for the people of Edinburgh, and in fact extending out to the whole of Scotland and the north of England. And we also do cutting-edge international research. And with the very recent incorporation of the Rosen Institute, we are very pleased that we came first in the vet schools in the UK in the research assessment exercise in 2008. So those are some of our activities. Very briefly, the history of the school is that in 1833, William Dick financed the building of the vet school in Clyde Street, which is where the bus station now stands. And he did this through his very extensive veterinary practice. And for the princely sum of £2,500, he managed to build the first vet school in Scotland. Under the leadership of Orlando Charnock Bradley, the school then moved to Summerhall Square, which is just at the end of the meadows. And then in 1962, under the leadership of Sir Alexander Robertson, it moved out to Easterbush to the clinical part moved out to Easterbush to the veterinary field station, about 7 miles outside Edinburgh. In 1999 to 2000, the Hospital for Small Animals was completed, which is a splendid building out at Easterbush. And more recent developments, earlier this year in spring, we opened a new veterinary cancer and imaging centre, which is one of the foremost in Europe. It's best provided, best staff, and we will be engaging in comparative cancer research there to really push forward therapies for cancer. The site, over the next couple of years, is going to expand dramatically Easterbush, and by 2011, we will have a brand new teaching building, which is coming in at the price of £42 million, which will have cutting-edge facilities and will be second to none in Europe. And also, early in 2011, we'll have the new Rosen Institute out there at Easterbush, right next to the school. And so in total, the vet field station will be transformed into the Easterbush campus, and we'll have about 2,000 people there on site. It obviously all goes with a price tag, and we are in the middle of a major fundraising campaign, and there are many sponsorship opportunities, and our fundraiser, Mr. David Ryder, is sitting there in the front if any of you are keen to spend some money. And I've now great pleasure in presenting Professor Richard Leakey. And I'm just going to give a quick bio of Richard. Richard Leakey is a name that's instantly recognisable to all of us who are interested in animals, conservation, the future. He's one of the famous Leakey dynasty, a true Kenyan, and he did several careers that have engaged him in paleontology, anthropology, museum administration, conservation, and he's been a senior figure in Kenya's politics and government administration. He's published a number of scientific and popular books, as well as presenting television documentaries. He currently serves as chairman for Transparency International Kenya. He's chairman of Wildlife Direct, and he holds a position of Professor of Anthropology at Stony Brook University in the United States. He's also working to develop a major new initiative to extend research into the origins of our species through the International Turkana Basin Institute in Kenya. Professor Leakey was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2007, and he holds a large number of honorary degrees from some of the world's most elite universities that recognise his global contributions and substantial reputation. He's won many international awards, including Fellowship of the Royal Society, medals from Yale, Harvard Museum of Natural History, the World Ecology Medal, and this one, which I love, the Order of the Burning Spear in Kenya. He has presented more than 750 lectures all over the world. He's written a number of books, and he's produced television series. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome him here tonight. And the title of his talk is Climate Change in Wilderness, Where Are We Headed? Professor Leakey.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite to be with you this afternoon. I wasn't thanking you yesterday, I was traveling here, but I'm glad to be here nonetheless. Thank you. I was asked whether I had any visual aids, and I said I didn't, because one either loses one's visual aids or one's words, and I thought it would be safer to just bring words rather than pictures. So you'll have to put up with a picture of me on the screen for the remainder of my, what hopefully won't be too long a talk. I was recently asked at a UN conference to talk about the resilience of the environment. And I guess there isn't any single thing that we could call the environment, and I guess it's equally difficult to talk about wilderness in that sense. I believe if it were possible, and I think many of us would dearly love to ask the coelacanth, this is the fish that lives down in the very deep waters off African coastline, how their environment was doing. I think they'd say it's doing extremely well, thank you, and it has been for over 150 million years, and they see no reason to be concerned. And many of the other species that live with them, like they, are in no way threatened by what's happening on this planet. But there are other environments, some of which we've taken for granted, like the polar ice caps, which I think today we realize are probably not safe. And there are many other environments that have changed very dramatically in living memory of people in this room, and of course even more dramatically over the period recorded by photographic histories that exist. And the issue at stake is whether, with the changes that we can see taking place, as a result of this phenomena that is referred to as climate change in the broader sense, there is a realistic future for wilderness areas that we have, many of us at least, have taken for granted as a permanent feature of planet Earth, and a feature that we can look forward to passing on to future generations with the pleasurable experiences that these wilderness areas have given us and given those before us, and hopefully those who come after us. And I think the answer has to be that the world has changed so much that many of the wilderness areas in East Africa, for example, that I know, certainly will never be wilderness areas again. They still support forms of life, but most of the life there is human, or, if you will, dependent on human in terms of sheep and cattle, donkeys and monocultures. The issue of climate change is something that has not been taken seriously in many parts of the world. And I think even to this day, and I'm sure many of you have this experience, there are people who still do not believe that is a factor or an issue that needs to be taken seriously in terms of how we plan, if not our government's expenditure program and policy, at least it's not taken seriously in terms of how we ourselves conduct ourselves. And the idea that we or I as an individual can have a significant impact on the planet and the wilderness through my contribution, which would generally be negative to the climate change phenomena, is lost on most people. And one of the most common questions I have been asked as I travel around the world, giving public speeches and talking at universities and other places, is there anything as an individual that we can do that would in any way mitigate or help what is clearly a situation that is worrying some people, if not everybody? And the answer has to be yes, although specifically it will change and vary dramatically. I would say at this point, and I think it's important to emphasize to those who still are naysayers, and many of them bring up the argument that climate change is not a new phenomenon. Climate change has been a part of the world, or the globe as we know it, from time beginning, and they're absolutely correct. Had there not been climate change and consequences on the environment, there would have been no evolution. And the reason those creatures living in the great depths of the ocean haven't changed, and the coelacanth is a contemporary of early dinosaurs, is that there's been no need to change because there's been nothing to adapt to except the constancy of where these creatures live. And so climate change is something that is indeed a part of the world, and is indeed fundamental to our existence, and is indeed fundamental to the existence that everything we see around us, and it would be foolish to deny that. The question that arises, however, is in the contemporary sense, the climate change is either being directly impacted or stimulated or affected by a species, Homo sapiens. And the magnitude of the population of Homo sapiens and the activities of Homo sapiens, both in terms of industrial activity, agricultural activity, and so on and so forth, has never been witnessed on this planet before. And it's not just that we are doing things that put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but it is also the fact that we have chopped up the planet into land use areas, not often land use that is necessarily wise or integrated in any strategic plan, but there are few options left for life to adapt quick enough to the changes that are being wrought through climate change, to the habitats that life exists in naturally as opposed to unnaturally in the human context. We can look at areas that are wilderness areas like national parks and realize that they are bounded by hard-edged boundaries. There is no longer a possibility for a herd of elephants to leave an area and go live somewhere else because they can't get to that area from where they live, because their plantations, their cities, their railway lines, their high-speed train and traffic arteries, and they just are where they are and will be where they are until we do something about it or we disappear from the planet. And in those circumstances, particularly with the diminutive size of many of the wilderness areas, extinction at a local population level, I think, is largely a certainty for much of life. And extinction on a continental basis may well be certain in many more cases than we currently are prepared to admit to. And I think this is something that very few people have taken into account when thinking about the wilderness and thinking about the areas of conservation that call out for public interest and public funding. And it is to that I have addressed several years of my life, to try to talk particularly to governments, to recognize that whilst it's going to be very hard to slow down the impact of climate change, we could at least provide some buffer zones and areas where the life expectancy of certain populations in wilderness areas of certain species will be extended because of the ability to move. There is now a lot of discussion about the possibility of forming corridors to enable wild species to move from place A to place B through human settlement areas. But a lot of this is rhetorical talk. It's very difficult to believe that whilst it may be possible to explain to an elephant the necessity of moving because you can drive it with a helicopter, I'm not sure you can necessarily persuade the other parts of its ecosystem to move along with it. And I don't think we necessarily know enough to be able to get the elephant to go and live somewhere where that species will survive, because the needs of that species may not be where we're sending it to. So I think there are all sorts of extremely complicated and difficult issues that we have to address in looking at this fraught question of climate change. The second thing I think that we need to understand, and I raise this, not that many of you probably need to be told, but I think it's a useful point to make in an address of this nature, is what do we actually mean by climate change? And I was struck recently, or several times in the last few years, by senior public figures in the United Nations and senior public figures in the academic fields still referring to if as a prefix for a statement they are going to make concerning temperature rise, changes in precipitation. And I, as recently as 3 weeks ago, I attended this meeting of the United Nations where there was a discussion that by the man who has credit for having created the Green Revolution in India. And he said, if polar temperatures rise by 2 degrees centigrade over the next 10 to 30 years, as is predicted, then there will be downstream consequences in the more tropical regions of the world. And I happened to have been in the Antarctic earlier this year, and we stopped off at several research stations where I was able to gain access to some of the records by using these wonderful qualities that you so kindly spoke that I have, FRS and things like that. It's relatively meaningless, but it's very useful to undo doors. So I was able to say to some of these researchers, I'm FRS, you know, and I have to go in and talk to you about this. And so I was able to get in on that pretext. And the temperature has risen by over 2 degrees Celsius already. It's not a question of if it does over the next 30 years. It has over the last 10. Why then are grown-up people in global positions of leadership referring to if? Why are they in such denial? And if they are, can we really expect the voter, the body public, the purveyor of influence, not to be similarly nonplussed as to, you know, what is the real answer? Glaciers, we were told, could start to disappear at a rate that was frightening, whereas they'd been retreating at 3 or 4 meters every 10 years in the Western Antarctic. At 2 research stations, including the American one, the Palmer Station, it has retreated in 10 years 375 meters in a decade. Not 2 or 3 meters in a decade, but over 350 meters in a decade. And it's melting at the bottom and it's melting at the top. And you can watch this thing just falling apart. And this is true in the north, in the polar caps, true in Greenland and Iceland. It's true on the mountains, the tropics, Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya, the Cascades, the whole chain of mountains along South America, all the way up through North America, the Alps, the ice is going. And I make no claim to be a rocket science, but I only know one thing that really makes ice turn to water, and that's temperature change. Funnily enough, and I say this knowingly, what I hadn't realized is that in the tropics, it actually hasn't risen very much at all. And that the temperature on the equatorial zone shows very little change over the last decade. And so what is going on? And I think what we have perhaps missed in explaining this phenomena is that as a result of polar melt, as a result of the mixture of very cold water with warmer waters, we're beginning to see a dramatic impact on weather patterns in terms of ocean currents. We're beginning to see an impact in terms of surface currents, meteorology, and things such as the trade winds and the monsoon winds. This will have, and is having already, a major impact on precipitation. And it is the absence or increase in rainfall that is probably far more of a threat in these tropical wilderness zones that we're talking about than temperature change per se. But the change in precipitation is being occasioned by temperature rise in places other than where the wilderness areas are, and we have been totally, I think, incompetent at putting that message across. And so people are befuddled, they're confused, and they're unclear. And I think this is something that I would challenge the academic community and those involved in the push to get people to understand that we really need to assume that people are a lot more intelligent than they are, and that they can take a story that is not complicated if it's explained to them from the beginning to the end, rather than assume that they're dumb and won't understand, so we can get away with just saying it's getting warmer. And then they freeze to death in the winter and say it's not getting warmer at all. The scientists are trying to raise grants by scaring us. And that is a common phenomenon that you hear, that scientists are in fact pulling the tail of the public by trying to create a drama where there isn't actually a drama. And personal experience tells you that it's not getting warmer at all in the tropics. But we are seeing climate change. We are seeing weather change. We are seeing rainfall change. And a recent piece of data that isn't yet published, but I believe will be in the next year, suggests that the temperatures in tropical East Africa, around Lake Turkana, where I spent 42 years of my life doing paleontological work, that the temperature probably hasn't varied more than a degree, if that, over the last 4 million years. And yet there are tens of thousands of species of mammal and other vertebrates and invertebrates that have become extinct during that period. And they become extinct because their environment, or their wilderness, in quotes, has changed. And it is clear to me that the likelihood is that they're responding to the effect of more or less rainfall in a more or less constant temperature, where humidity and absence of humidity are having a far bigger impact on the complexity of the food chain and the complexity of the ecosystem that they're a part of. And I think this is something that we really need to take on board, at least in explaining why there's a crisis, if not necessarily coming to grips with solutions to the crisis. But having raised this issue of water, and I believe that the water issue is probably far more important in terms of the majority of the tropical areas, I think we need to look at whether water isn't in fact the one area where each of us can make a difference. We can look at the use of water around the world and we can realize that we waste most of it. Now, it may be true that in the northern and southern temperate zones there is far more water than the current population requires, but water is part of a closed system. There is a global atmospheric condition. There are all sorts of ways that what happens in one place can affect what happens in another place. And I think the misuse of water and the abuse of water, particularly in agriculture, but also in domestic areas, and the pollution of water and the destruction of water towers and water catchment is something that all of us could have a far bigger impact on than many of us care to believe. And I think one of the challenges of the next 10, 15 years is to see if we can't persuade governments to take a greater interest in the crisis of water and the impact that water is going to have on the future of humankind, related domestic species, and of course the future of the wilderness areas that we talk about. We, at the moment, don't know a great deal about what has happened in the past, but I think it is very clear that the new technology and the new sciences that are being brought to bear on geological deposits where there are preserved previous forms of life represented as fossils do offer opportunities to now begin to look at, through isotopes and other techniques, the impact of previous climate change to both temperature, which is obviously an important driving force behind it, but far more importantly, in the areas that have had this proliferation of species, the tropics, the impact of water regime changes affected by previous temperature changes on the survival of individual species. We are looking today as an ad hoc example, which I'm sure you'll see far more of on newspaper and media in the coming years. We're looking at a continent of Africa today where the impact of drought is absolutely phenomenal. And at the moment in East Africa, the impact of drought exceeds anything I've seen in my adult lifetime in East Africa. Entire areas have been decimated of wildlife. And there's nowhere for replenishing wildlife to come because the wilderness areas outside the protected areas that did have wildlife, where there was no conflict with people, are now overrun by people and where there is no longer wildlife to move back in. And I think the depletion of wildlife in wilderness areas in tropical Africa and probably tropical South Central America and tropical Asia is going to be far bigger than we have taken account for. Of course, it also has impact, and I think it's worth saying this, not just on wilderness and wildlife, which, after all, I suppose we could do without. It would be unfortunate if we didn't have the spectacular beauty of nature as we have known it. But there are many people who live in Edinburgh who've never been out of Edinburgh and have never had the opportunity to experience the Serengeti or the tropical Amazon or places of this kind. And are they necessarily the worse off for it? They may be the poorer for it in terms of personal experience, but they're healthy, hopefully, and they're educated, hopefully, and they live a full life, which is a moving feast in its own. But if there was never an elephant left on the planet except in picture books, would it really matter? And there are people who say, no, it wouldn't really matter. But the question is, if the elephant disappears because of the loss of the hydrological systems that have enabled it to survive so many million years, what's he going to do to this species that's talking and listening tonight? Can we live in a planet that has created circumstances where elephants can't survive? The loss of wildlife in the drought in Africa today is going to be phenomenal. And to a very large extent, that's what's going to attract ITV and BBC and your equivalents up here. But the loss in terms of livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, donkeys, camels, the loss of crops and the loss of human life as a result of that, the spread through new habitat developing of certain diseases that will affect the ability for people to live is phenomenal. And I was talking to Professor Crispin earlier today that it doesn't take much, and up here would be less water than more temperature, for some of the diseases that affect horses to spread to this part of the world. And you could get the equine fever or equine flu moving into Norfolk and the race courses and places there. And you have a problem. These are not things of cloven hoofs that you can shoot because the government thinks you should. But these are worth millions and millions of pounds. And is a racehorse owner going to allow the government to come in and shoot your studier questioning? What do we do about many of these things? And I think it's no longer possible for us to say, well, we're all right. The poor old elephant, but they were in Europe and they were in North America and they're not, and we're not worse off for it. But I think it really is a challenge that faces all of us, and I think we're beginning to come to terms. Can one afford to be optimistic about the wilderness? I have to confess, I don't think so. Not in the time frame that is left to me, and I would wager most of you in this room. I think the pace of change, the pace of loss, the pace of loss of food chains, the impact of breaks in food chains that we don't yet fully understand is too fast for much of this to have a snowball's chance in hell of surviving for the next 50 to 100 years. Does that mean that it's gone forever? Or does it mean that there's still something we can do? Does it mean that we just give up? Or does it mean that there are things that would be worth discussing and considering? And I'm accused of always trying to find something positive. And I will try and talk a little bit about this before I conclude, because I do actually feel that there are some positive things that can be done. I think the first thing is to recognize, which again few of us do, and it's difficult to put across, is that we're talking about 100 years. Homo sapiens, like us, have been around at least 70,000 years. Homo sapiens, quite like us, but not necessarily just like us, have been around 200,000 years. And human ancestors have been around several million years. Now, are we really giving up because we're looking at a crisis that's going to affect the next 100 years? Or should we be slightly more foresighted and slightly more conscious that it would be an abrogation of our sapience component of our name to give up? Could we not recognize that even though there is a crisis, could we not recognize that even though greenhouse gases appear to be moving at a pace that is going to melt much of the glaciers, affect many of the ocean currents, interrupt the monsoons, cause weather patterns that will bring flood and famine and different forms in different places, are we not willing to recognize with the progress of science that over the next 100 years, with a determination, that some of these processes can be reversed? Should we not try to retain many of these wilderness areas, even if they don't support elephant, even if they don't support rhino, even if they don't support the biodiversity that enables 15 or 20 species of predator to live happily in those areas? Are there not ways in which we could preserve those predators in terms of gene banks? Are there not ways in which a lot of these things couldn't be put safely away to be bought out by our descendants in 100 years' time and reintroduced? Should we give up on the planet and all try and get off on the next space shuttle? Or should we recognize that there are things to do? And I think we've got to be very careful not to go from doom and gloom to more doom and gloom, but actually recognize that there's a crisis, it's real. There are technological fixes that are longish term, but not very long term. And should we not realize that our lifetime, at best, of being useful is 60, 70 years, depending on whether you consider your first 10 useful or your last 10 useful, but it's a relatively short space of time. Should we not accept that a lifetime in itself isn't worth giving up on the planet? Surely we can all agree it's certainly not worth in terms of the lifetime of a politician in politics. 2, 4, 6, 8 years? I mean, why do we allow men and women to threaten the survival of the planet we have loved? Because their career is tied to a time frame of not even a decade? Are we mad? Yes. Do we have to be mad? No. This is what I would put to you. And I honestly think that the time has come for people to start recognizing that, yes, we have a real problem. But it's not the end of the planet. The planet has not gone for all time. Wilderness areas don't necessarily have to go for all time. They will still be wilderness. They just won't have the things in them that are there today. Could they be put back? We know they could. We know that people at the school that we're speaking in honor of tonight, vets and scientists, have all sorts of capacities to come up with ideas, to maintain genetic diversity, either in frozen tissue or some new techniques. Should we not be legislating to ensure some of these things can be done? I think the answer is absolutely yes, we should. And I think we should start talking much more about the other possibilities than simply, it's all over. Poor children, poor grandchildren, most unfortunately great-grandchildren. I think we've got to be more positive about that and think that something can be done. The second thing is, and I'll conclude on this note, is why do we allow politicians around the world to get away with the negligent handling of their country's affairs in terms of the environment? It wasn't so many years ago that slavery was popular, justified in parliaments. It wasn't so many years ago that the idea of universal suffrage, voting rights for everybody over 18, was an anathema. I'm old enough to have visited the States when discrimination on color was the order of the day, where you couldn't go to certain places if you have a certain ethnic background. When torture was expected, in many countries it still is expected, where abuse of human rights was taken for granted. But there are now international conventions that are beginning to be prosecuted, which say that if a government willfully allows certain abuses of human rights, the leaders of the day in that government can be prosecuted. We've seen it in Middle Europe. We're beginning to see it in Africa. We're seeing it in South and Central America. Is handing over a country that is so much worse off than when you took it on not an abuse of human rights? Have our politicians any right to expect unborn children to live in the mess they're creating through negligence? Could we not, through public pressure, get an international convention that will list specific crimes against humanity where willful negligence and willful action that destroy waterways and destroy lakes and destroy other forms of life that are so critical to the future of this planet, where this is a crime against humanity? Do we just say, well, it's never been done? A lot of these things were never done. Should we not fight? And I believe we should fight. And I believe there's absolutely no way that you can say, well, it's a poor African country. Let them destroy the water systems. Let them cut the forest down. Poor people have nothing to cook on. Surely there's another way. Surely there's a way where you can draw attention to these issues, find international solutions to these issues, and move the process forward in a constructive, positive way. Sure, it's not going to happen in the next decade or 2 decades, but could it not happen in 40, 50 years for the whole world? Is that too late for many? But if taken in concert with other actions and other thinkings, is it too late? No. It's too late if you've got a 4-year life as a politician. It's probably too late if you're in your upper 60s and feeling the age or beyond. But you're entering the non-useful part anyway, and we have to accept that. So should we not be encouraging at our schools and our colleges and our youth clubs some new thinking on this thing? I would have thought we should, and I don't hear this. I don't hear people saying, damn it, it's the unborn generation's right to have a healthy planet. If it is their right, as it is to a life without torture, as it is to a life without no health, as it is to a life without education, as it is to a life without representational government, surely it's a right that we can enshrine in an international protocol of some kind, even though it may take us a decade or so to get through the huge challenges of bureaucracy that we've set up. I think it's doable, and I think it's possible, and I think it's realistic. It's not for us as a generation, it's for us as a species to tackle these things. And you've got as much opportunity to influence the outcome of these actions in Edinburgh as we do in Nairobi. And I think we should get together and do things, because we're talking about at most a window of 100 years. And 100 years, truly, is nothing. It may seem a lot if you're alive, and you don't have that much time anyway. But in terms of evolution and the richness of life on this planet, and the history and heritage of the wilderness, and the time frame that climate change that we're addressing is about, 100 years is absolutely nothing. And if you think, as many of you will be aware, of what has happened in the last 100 years, globally, surely the next 100 years is a doable challenge for us to undertake. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm staying here. I thought you were doing the questions.
I hope you're doing the questions. Thank you very much, Richard. That was a lecture given truly from the heart, and I think it was very stirring. Now, can I have questions from the floor, please, for Professor Leakey? Yes. There are roving microphones. There's one on its way.
It's so that you can be recorded.
Professor, I visited Kenya about 40 odd years ago, and the population was 6 million. I think today it's now 36.
Well, we just had a census, it's 42.
Yeah. But you didn't mention the I was going to say sixfold increase, sevenfold increase in population, that has effect on wildernesses.
Well, no, I didn't mention it, and there are a host of other things I didn't mention either, but I'm facing a very large clock, and I'm very cognizant of your time, and indeed mine. I think the problem with population is that unless you revert to methods and forms of social control that the free world fought hard to get rid of and continues to fight as a human right, I don't think you can legislate about who has children and who doesn't. And I therefore think that if one were totally realistic, one would say if the human population crashed suddenly from 6 or 7 billion to less than 1 billion, many of these problems would resolve themselves quite quickly. But it's not going to crash in the next 100 years in a controlled way if it crashed at all. Now, it might. But I don't think we should count on a crash. And what I think we should count on is that as people gain affluence, or modest affluence, they generally, around the world, show signs of self-control in their growth patterns. And you certainly see this in the economic strata in the developing world. is that parents who have had a good education and who have money and use the money to educate generally have much smaller families. And to put it in a very simple descriptive form for some of you who may not fully understand what I'm saying, is that many people in my country, Kenya, will say to you, look, I haven't had a job in my life. It's extremely difficult to make ends meet. If I have 10 children, the chances are 1 in 10 that one of them will do well and look after me in old age. If I have 2, one could die early and the other could become a thief. So it's better to have more than fewer in the eyes of the very, very low economic level of people. It's not just Kenya, it's a phenomena of the developing world that poverty breeds the human population. And we are far past the carrying capacity on this planet for a consumptive species such as Homo sapiens. And we could spend the next hour talking about that. And I think a lot of people would agree, some wouldn't. We in Kenya, and I've been in government, have done quite a lot of pushing on this, and we are undermined practically at every turn by the right to life and the anti family planning contraception movement, not least led by, until very recently, by the one big power that could have done more to help this, that is the United States.
Sorry, I meant the population increase tends to make people who are hungry go into wildernesses and eat the animals.
It's not significant. I mean, it's happening, but no, that's not the loss of wilderness. To a large extent, most of Africa is still wilderness, but it's becoming harder and harder to use it usefully. And again, it's water's the crisis.
Yes, question over there.
Thank you. When the first politician is indicted for crimes against the environment and the prosecutor asks, what did you know and when did you know it, his defense counsel will, play upon his ignorance or make a case of his ignorance because there's so many things that they don't know in evidence-based ecology. It's very hard to maintain a perennial grass and clover sward over a number of years in the same proportion under grazing animals. So how much more difficult is it in a complex environment? We have in the city of Edinburgh lots of actuaries whose work has done wonders for public health medicine, but there are very few actuarial tables, if any, for plants and animals. And is there a space for, is there time, is it worthwhile for people to be actuaries of plants and animals so we find out more about these relationships over time so that people can make more informed decisions and the politicians don't get off with their indictment by saying, well, we didn't know.
Well, I think to a certain extent what you're saying is correct, but I would offer this, is that, there are an awful lot of people who say, I didn't know that it was wrong to torture people. And indeed, it was a custom for hundreds and thousands of years to get the truth, or what would do as the truth in terms of the public court, by torture. People didn't know and didn't believe, with the greatest respect to the audience, that women had rights. Go to Saudi Arabia today and ask them. I was a member of parliament in Kenya where we tried to get through a bill empowering women in certain areas. We had 7 female members of parliament, and to the woman, they opposed the bill. They said we were interfering with culture. Now, of course these things are going to be challenged, and of course it's going to be difficult, and it cannot be a panacea, and it cannot be a one-size-fits-all. But it does seem one thing that you can do, and I think one way to begin to look at it is to recognize the irresponsibility of international organizations. There is currently international plans to finance the damming of a river that feeds into Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, which will impoverish, if not destroy, the livelihoods of 500,000 people. The environmental impact assessment was single-sourced and was altered to fit the investors' and contractors' needs. This is not a secret, it's public knowledge. In those sort of cases, you could get action. Now, you're going to get an awful lot of people get away with it. But what I'm saying is, at the moment, we can do nothing about it. And ignorance, as you know, doesn't always work in defense against the law. And I think when the people who formulate these ideas obviously will have to be looking at these sort of questions. And I don't for a minute suggest it's going to be easy. But I think we need to start at least talking about it. And somebody said to me the other day that if you told the mayors of the cities of the western seaboard of the United States, San Francisco and Los Angeles, that by willfully allowing people to buy land that is just above sea level, and that you were preparing legislation that would enable them to be sued for misleading the public into making these bad investments, they'd be a lot more careful about what they allowed to pass through the House. And, you know, you probably need to put one into court, threaten him with $1 billion fine, and the rest would start thinking, well, I need more advice on this. This is probably not the way to go. So I think we've got to try. And there's a lot of precedent. It's not going to be easy. But I don't think we can just say it can't be done because it's the environment and it's too loose.
Question at the back there.
We're very fortunate in Scotland that this year the strongest piece of climate change legislation in the world has been passed, which came about partly because of pressure from the public on their MSPs. We had the biggest mass lobby of Parliament in June this year that's ever been seen, where members of the public came along and expressed their concerns directly to the people who bring about that legislation. And Scotland will be going to Copenhagen to meet the rest of the world in December, and the rest of the world is looking at our small nation to see what they can learn from us. And what we can do as individuals is to keep up the pressure on the politicians to let them know that we do care, and as well as doing what we can do in our own personal lives to keep up the dialogue that we're so lucky to have.
Well, thank you. I think that was more of a comment than a question, and being a national of another country, I should probably be conscious of what you've said, but not necessarily enter into it in this forum. But yeah, I am aware and very proud.
Mr. Scott.
Seems a bit, aren't there no mics on this side? We're going to come this side. This young lady's getting tired.
Thank you very much. As an MSP and a politician, I feel I must at least say something, and it is particularly to ask you a question. Since 1961 in Scotland, we've had 20% more rainfall annually. Could you make a prediction about where that might go in the next 50 years? And also, could you give us your advice as a world authority on these matters, what we should be doing about food security, about the fact that the world population is likely to increase from 6 billion at the moment to 9 billion by 2050, and what your views are on genetically modified foods and the Malthusian prospect?
Well, I have been a politician. There are certain parts of your questions that I would choose not to answer. So, let's start with genetically modified foods. There is a legitimate debate about safety, but I think the debate is seldom held in the context of real starvation that's taking place in different parts of the world. And I think the debate probably should concern more about transparency, about the issues that are actually on the table, and they should be concerned more about the fairness of multinationals and big companies exploiting hunger and poverty through genetically modified foods that they're not necessarily telling the whole story about in any event. And I think, per se, I would be pro finding ways to feed people, but within some limitations. And I think when, from the perspective of Kenya or the developing world or Africa, one would probably answer the question slightly differently than you would if you were CEO of one of the big multinationals that is in this business. And I think you follow what I'm saying. what could be done, what would enhance and increase the capacity to internationalize some of the solutions. I think that was the drift of part of your question. Well, I think the first thing that we've got to do, and I would say we need to do very urgently, is get people to recognize the reality that there is a crisis. And I think the denial that continues to pervade governments, bureaucracies, seats of learning is quite worrying. And I think the politics of survival of an issue of this magnitude, where global weather patterns, including monsoonal precipitation, is at stake, require more than flip debate allocated by the speaker of a particular sitting as to who can contribute. And I think there needs to be a lot more to that than we're allowing. And I think it is a critical issue, and I don't think we're giving the time of day to something that is so significant. And I think, thirdly, that it is trite to say we're part of a global village, and yet the interdependence syndrome that is developing is again a phenomena that is not necessarily taken on board by many people in a profession that you're from and I was part of. We tend to make sound bites that are helpful to perhaps less than the future of the planet and more to our own futures or our own assembly's future or our own government's future. And I think there really needs to be a lot more frank and candid discussion about this being something that has to be addressed at far higher level than a state level. And there needs to be a buy-in that we're not seeing at the moment in terms of some of these questions. But as you know, and you must know better than I, because you probably spent your life in these fields, and I haven't, these are easy to talk about, harder to do, but nonetheless we have to keep talking about them to get something done anyway. And that would be my urging. Thank you. I sounded like a politician, I'm sorry.
Any more questions? I think I saw...
There's one at the back there.
Yeah, one at the back. Need the microphone up there, please.
I'm concerned because it's clear that the world is hugely overpopulated, and yet people are only likely to reduce their birth rates if their society becomes a developed one. In other words, if it begins to have what we have, and there aren't enough resources, we're going to trash the planet if that happens. So could you possibly comment on that?
Well, I will comment, but it's as I said, I don't propose or present myself as a bearer of answers to every question. But what I would say this, and I have heard the question along those lines from many people, particularly in Western countries and particularly in the United States. And one of the questions I would ask is that there's a huge distance between having your children walk to school for 10 kilometers and maybe get a cereal meal with water for 1 meal a day, to 3 meals a day and a car for each member of the family, and an acceptance of the culture of obsolescence, where if somebody has a green car that has a cutback, that you must get one too, because your children will otherwise think that you're not part of the show. I think the wastage in developed countries at the consumer level, if that were reduced, it would not reduce the standard of life that you live. And I do not believe that a householder in middle America is any better off because they have a television in every room that anyone goes into on most of the time, and that they change their refrigerator every 2 years because somebody else did down the street. I think a refrigerator that works and enough vehicles to get you where you need to be for legitimate purposes other than dragging the main street is a legitimate requirement. And enough nutrition that you don't lose weight, but you don't necessarily gain it to the point of obesity is a legitimate requirement. And I believe an awful lot more of the people on this planet could live a life that has those expectations than could live a life where they expect to throw away more than 50% of what they purchase. And I don't know in Scotland, I'm not a frequent visitor to this area of the world. But I do know in the US and in some of the Canadian cities, you go to colleges, and I would wager that at least 50% of what is served in student cafeteria is thrown away. And whether it's eaten or thrown away, it's cost the same amount of energy to produce and the same amount of abuse of the land to produce. And I think we should take it in steps. But if we could eliminate waste as a beginning, you might get a mindset change that is important. There are people living in areas of the world where when you get in, and I'm not sure in Scotland whether it's here yet, but where you have a shower rather than a bath or a tub or whatever you want to call it. But in America, you get into a shower and you turn it on full. And the water's gushing out because of pressure pumps at such a rate that you wonder, what this could be for. And you get under it, and you don't turn it off so that you can soap yourself down, but you try to get the soap to do its job under this torrent of water. And you get irritated because the soap suds aren't developing, but you keep at it, and you spend 15 minutes because it actually feels quite nice and prickly on your back. And then you've forgotten to wash your hair properly and didn't get the conditioner on the right way, so you do it again. And 20 minutes later, you've probably gone through 40, 60, 80 gallons of water, none of which has improved your livability with. And it's unnecessary to waste food and water, and to waste metal and plastic, and to waste fuel and power and these things. It's not that we shouldn't have it. And I'm all in favor of a car to drive in, and I'm all in favor of a meal to eat, but not to throw away. I mean, that makes no sense. And so why don't we tackle that first as a starting point? And that's something we can do individually. If that works, then maybe you get another change, and you begin to say, well, I don't need 3 cars, actually. The carpool's a good idea. It's costing me an awful lot more to drive 3 than 1, so it would change. The Americans don't want to pay more for fuel. They pay 1/8 of what we pay for fuel in Kenya. And they earn 10 times what we earn in Kenya. I mean, why don't we start thinking about the planet and not local planet? So I take your point, but I do think something can be done. And I think we need to be realistic and take small bites at a time, but recognize that if we can take enough bites over the next 100 years, we can actually reverse some of the things that have happened to this planet. That would be my take on what we're doing. And a lot of people would disagree and think it's too late and too far gone. I can see you feel the way I'm saying that some people feel, perhaps. But, the nice thing, or one of the good things about being human is we can all have views. And some sell their views to bigger groups than others. It hasn't always got us where we want to be, but it's part of the business of being human. So thank you again, and I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking Professor Leakey for an absolutely wonderful lecture, which was truly thought-provoking and will give us plenty to think about over the next week or so, if not 100 years. I'd like to thank very much my team at the Dick Vet for organising this lecture, for Neil Wilson, Tom Mortimer, David Ryder, Richard Schoen, Colin Warwick for producing the history of the Dick Vet. And I would like to thank all of you for coming to join us this year for the William Dick Lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.